And welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm blessed to be joined by Dr. Dylan, research fellow at the Acton Institute, founder and president of St. Nicholas Cabasilas Institute, and author of The Kingdom of God and the Common Good, but also one of the editors of this recently published book by Acton Institute called The Christian Roots of American Liberty. And I'm really blessed to have him join us here. Dylan, thank you for making the time. How are you?
It's great to be here. I'm doing great. This is one of the best weeks of the year. We always look forward to this.
So, me too. And I want to jump right into this, given that we don't have a lot of time. A very common attack we're seeing coming out of those who are crying out for anywhere from a Christian national, like a pure Christian nationalist perspective, to even a kind of integralist, we desire a theocracy narrative, is that this republic and its foundations on liberty are purely either Masonic or the product of the Enlightenment, and therefore it's not only incompatible, it's simply not salvageable when you think about the Christian perspective.
Right.
I want to begin there. I want to ask you to speak to that.
Yeah, so I think there's this weird irony with that perspective, and it does come in a variety of forms, as you mentioned. But basically, they've taken almost like a left-wing critique, trying to say that, Christianity is just always autocratic and unfree, and they've accepted it. And they said, well, therefore, we don't want liberty.
Yeah.
And the reality is that is not the case at all. Well, of course, there are some illiberal periods and times in our history, and that all that's true. But the history is there's more stories to be told, and that's what we wanted to do with this book. Is we wanted to push back against those folks because really they haven't done their homework, and we wanted to give people the sources so that they could actually read them and make their own judgment and actually see for themselves that, oh yeah, it doesn't mean that the Enlightenment wasn't involved. And you know what? Some of the founding fathers were Freemasons, it's true. But we also know, for example, that like Tertullian owned the works, Jefferson owned the works of Tertullian and underlined the passages about religious liberty. So when you see in the Virginia Statute, which is in here, and you see in Tertullian, which is in here, not only that they're both for religious liberty, but they make the exact same argument. You can see, in that case, a direct line of influence. And there's, I think, all kinds of more indirect lines, whether it's religious liberty, natural law, private property, consent of the governed. You can go all the way back to the ancient church and through the Middle Ages and to the early modern era, and show how there is a long Christian story that unfortunately we've lost and needs to be told again.
And I'm really grateful that you bring that up, because I think we often forget that religious liberty is one of those early and, dare I say, foundational tenets for the propagation of the gospel. And so the fathers, Tertullian being, one of the early Christian authors, is one of the strongest proponents of it. You see it in strains in Justin Martyr and Irenaeus. And so it becomes very clear that when we talk about the notion of a plurality of religions, it's not that Christianity is saying all religions are equal.
No.
But that the freedom of conscience is necessary for the embrace of life in Christian covenant.
Yes, absolutely. And, they say early on, I think in a text we have there, the Epistle to Diognetus, that God chose not to save us by compulsion, but by persuasion, because compulsion is not God's way of working. And, Tertullian and Jefferson following him later, also Lactantius, said, what God would want someone to be forced to worship him? That's an incredibly impious view of God, no matter your religion. We just wanted this freedom. Christians were already operating and growing, and the church had a massive, charitable operation. But every now and then, you get the wrong magistrate say, "We got to do something about these Christians." They'd confiscate their property, they'd send them to the mines, and they said, "Just treat us like everybody else. We just want to be treated like it. Let us preach the gospel and do our work, and let people choose for themselves." That's all they wanted. And amazingly, that's originally all they got from the first Christian emperor, right? The Edict of Milan was not an establishment of the church. It was a declaration of religious liberty.
A lot of people misunderstand that. We seem to think that was when Christianity became an empire religion. But actually, contrary to that, it was given the right to function in freedom alongside the other religions, and that made all the difference.
Absolutely, yeah.
So going back to Tertullian and Lactantius, if you look at those who are pushing for a kind of theonomic or a theonomic regime, or even a theocracy, the problem, one of the core problems that's being put forth is the argument is moral evil should never be tolerated in the civic sphere, and therefore, since evil is being tolerated, let's do away with this and start legislating all morality.
Right.
It sounds really good on paper.
Right.
Even that one sentence, right? But it presents a host of moral and justice problems.
Yes, absolutely. I think, we're here at the Acton Institute's conference at Acton University, and so there's a lot of economists here. And one thing, my background's theology, but one thing I've really come to appreciate by economists, they'll ask, well, but then what? Right? What are the alternatives? What are the unintended consequences? And we have examples of this in history. For example, prohibition in the United States. There was a really noble ideal behind that. They wanted temperance. They wanted to reduce drunkenness and domestic violence. And really, they only marginally reduced alcohol use. And the unintended result was a massive explosion of organized crime.
Yep.
And so it's just not that simple. There are certain rules of human social behavior that are constant throughout history and across polities, and you just ignore them at your own peril. So certainly, of course, I want a perfectly just and moral society, but I know that one of the inherent, traits of virtue is that it has to be freely cultivated. So I want a strong church that is advocating faithfully the gospel and the way of life that Christ taught us. But I don't want to try to force people to do it because it's actually self-contradictory. You can't force someone to build virtue. Now, can we prevent harm to other people? Can we, have laws in place to make sure people have equal treatment, things like that? Well, yes, that is something that we are capable of doing. And again, you see that in early Christian writings as well and all throughout the centuries. But there are limits to what any law can do, no matter how noble and morally it is conceived.
And thereby, when we think about the average American, but also just Christians living within the American Republic, how ought we to think about our life, our presence, and our function within this social sphere, given that it is not a theocracy?
Right. Well, so, one thing I've really love about being American, love about learning about American history is our understanding of religious liberty or separation of church and state. It's very different than, say, like a French version. The French, and even in Quebec, they have laïcité, right? Yep. Where it's very much like don't even wear a cross on a public space, And so religion is out of the public sphere. It's never been the case in the United States. Everyone has always been welcome to speak from within their own religious or non-religious background and to say this is why it ought to be this way, and to enter into the conversation fully themselves. So I think we should certainly care about threats to free speech, threats to free expression, things that would curtail those liberties, because those are going to reduce the power of the church. But one thing I tell people who are really worried, they say, we want to have the state enforce the true church. For one thing, you got to convince everybody your church is the true church.
Yeah.
I have strong opinions about mine, but not everybody's going to agree. Exactly. But secondly, St. Paul taught the Romans that the gospel of the power of God to salvation for all who believe. And you're telling me that God needs Caesar to make that happen? Mm-hmm. I'm pretty sure he doesn't. I'm pretty sure Jesus said quite the opposite, right?
Exactly.
And so I think that's the danger there is you say, we want it so much, we're gonna ask Caesar to do it for us. Uh-huh. When the whole point is, there's some things that are Caesar's, but there's some things that are God's. And we want to call people to those higher things through our churches.
I'm talking with Dr. Dylan Pahman. He's research fellow at the Acton Institute, a founder of the Nicholas Cabasilas Institute, and we're talking about this book that he and John Pinero edited called The Christian Roots of American Liberty that's published by Acton Institute. And one of the things that we're highlighting here particularly is that we cannot pretend that the founding of this great republic was purely the work of either Masonic or natural law or even Enlightenment principles, but that anything that was good, true, and beautiful from that overflows from the mind of God, and it bleeds through the entire Christian intellectual patrimony. And so we're going to continue on the other side of the break, and we're going to touch on the principles that came out of the School of Salamanca, the scholastic schools, and all of this to show us that, no, we as Christians can be proud to be citizens of this great republic and to sanctify it from within. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. And we're back. I'm talking with Dr. Dylan Pahman. He is research fellow at the Acton Institute and one of the editors of this volume, The Christian Roots of American Liberty. So, Dylan, I want to pick up where we left off. I thought it was a very beautiful exhortation that you left us with and something to really consider and ponder on. the fact of the matter is Christians have a home in this nation, and it doesn't matter what strain of Christianity. So we've had some level of Catholic persecution in some of the earlier parts of United States history, and therefore we should be one of the first ones as Catholics to be able to say, thereby, I don't want a theocracy.
Yeah, right. I mean, this is the temptation. People want to take power, political power, use it for their preferred end. But they never think about, well, what happens when the other party gets control? What happens, whether it's political party or someone from another religion or whatever? I mean, you see that in England between, you had Henry VIII and you had Mary, and then, this back and forth. It was bloody and it did not go well. I don't see any reason why we should want that for our own country, right? People fled to the United States, long before it was even its own nation, for religious liberty and self-determination, so they could be the ones who are self-governing their own communities. And sometimes that was messy too, but it always trended towards religious liberty, towards integrating religious minorities, including Roman Catholics, including Jewish people, and now people of other religions. And I think that's been a beautiful thing, and I think it's been a very Christian thing. Given the history that we present in our book.
Now, as you rightly highlighted, given the history that we've seen, we have a necessity, therefore, to learn how to operate as Christians within the social political order that we've inherited. And therefore, the question arises, based on criticisms that are being given, has classical liberalism in the American experiment failed? And was this failure due to the founding principles?
I mean, I guess it depends on what your standard is, whether it's failed. Its goal was to create a free society where everyone could pursue, the American dream, pursuit of happiness, that sort of thing. Own your own property, live your life according to your own principles, follow your conscience. I think it still can do that today. There are challenges in every generation, but I see the folks who want to oppose that are the sort who want to raise more barriers rather than tear them down. And, I think it's a success on plenty of metrics. But, I probably don't have the same metric as them, I suppose. But, I look at it in terms of, you can look at material prosperity, but you can also look at things like just the fact that you can find your church. You mentioned that you're a convert to the faith. I'm a convert to the Greek Orthodox Church. I'm so glad that I live in a country that I could just one day say, I'm going to go to this church, and no policeman stopped me at the door. That's a beautiful thing, and we really should not take it for granted.
I lived in a nation where saying Jesus Christ, I grew up in it, saying Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, the life, can put a target on your back, period. Syncretism is the only way Christianity can survive there. And so I'm proud to be part of a nation where I can say Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, the life, to the glory of God the Father. And no one's going to kick down my door. And so something clearly is working. Also, I want to ask you to speak to this.
Sure.
I've lived in different nations before. The claim is, out of over 200 sovereign nations, over 150 of them have constitutional liberty, and therefore what makes America special? Liberty in these other nations is not like the liberty we have here.
Yeah. So there's lots of kinds of liberalism. That's another problem I have with these claims. We do give a general definition at the start, but then we really focus on there's a specifically American tradition, which comes out of a specifically British tradition. And as I said earlier, that's very different than, say, the French. You could also contrast it with the Germans or, whatever. And it's not to say there's nothing good in those traditions, but there's a very different approach to faith and public life. And so what we find in the American tradition, our point of this book is not that America existed before America. It didn't, right? Of course it didn't, It's okay. But there's this unique synthesis of Christian principles, Christian ideas that comes together in a justification for liberty that has a explicitly theological one, at least in the Declaration of Independence, which is what we're celebrating this year, that it's, the laws of nature and nature's God, right?
And the fact that that's written into the document.
Right. And the defense of the Constitution, you can find James Madison saying, well, if men were angels, we could just trust, we don't have to worry about corruption and everything like that. There's always kind of this assumed moral and religious culture, and all of the founding fathers talk about this, that you have to have a moral culture and even a religious culture to sustain this democracy. And I think you see in a lot of other countries, some of it's just on paper. I mean, there were some beautiful sounding communist constitutions,
Yes.
right? But in practice, it didn't matter. It was just a piece of paper.
Can we also
right?
acknowledge that the USSR had religious liberty enshrined?
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. And I'm from an Orthodox background.
Right.
Trust me, they did not have religious liberty. We have literally millions of martyrs from that period. And so you have to actually live it. And what's been amazing and genuinely exceptional about America is that it's really led the way, despite all of our problems, despite all of our struggles, and actually living that out.
So, in other words, as we're taking a look at the criticisms against what I dare say are the magnificent blessings that God has given us in this republic, we're seeing a kind of ephemeral, idealistic mentality, an idealism that simply doesn't exist.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's this weird sort of people read about liberalism in books, and they don't see it all around them, which is crazy to me because, again, like I've experienced it, right? I changed religious traditions. I was evangelical and I became Greek Orthodox. And, we vote, like we do it, like we do all this stuff. But then a picture of liberalism comes from some random person's opinion. Actually, some of these people are getting it from Carl Schmitt, who is like an actual Nazi. So I'm not really the most reliable source. And then they're projecting that onto either the present day or the founding era or something like that. And it's just a fiction. And again, that's why we didn't just write a book, we made a reader.
Yes.
Because we really wanted to show people, not only do we have all these Christian sources, but we do have some founding fathers in there. We do have some early state constitutions, some excerpts and things like that. So you can see the continuity, you can see the difference. There's variety. I don't think somebody's going to come away with this say, now I know what party to vote for, right? But I hope they're going to come away with it with a greater appreciation, both for their faith and for, what it means to be a citizen in this country.
And thereby we can also acknowledge that there was a certain brilliance to this.
Yes.
I dare say a providential hand guiding that brilliance.
Yeah, I mean, they thought so, and these were people that believed in providence, and so I think that's so key to any free order. Alexis de Tocqueville visited America in the 19th century, and he was amazed at how free the Puritans were. Right, the Puritans have this reputation for having a law against everything and whatever, but it was almost the opposite, right? Where like those laws were meaningless because nobody was going to break them anyway. And why? Well, because they believed in providence. They're Calvinists; they really believe in providence, and they just know that there's a lot that God's going to take care of. And if God's going to take care of a lot, the state doesn't have to do everything.
Right, and you don't have to legislate everything.
Yeah.
And so therein lies the great concern, because even as you move on to, like I mentioned earlier before the break, the School of Salamanca, and then some of the scholastic thought, especially in Thomas Aquinas, and thinking about the question of government, we see here a consistent thread that, no, you don't want the state and its legislation to move beyond the virtue of the populace. In fact, that's going to generate more problems in the long run.
Right. Yeah, everyone needs to be subject to the law. The principle of the rule of law is a Christian principle, and it goes back even to the Old Testament. There's verses in Deuteronomy: do not judge the rich or the poor with any preferential treatment. Doesn't matter where they're coming from in life. The law needs to be the ultimate ruler. And one way to ensure that, or one aspect of that, is somehow incorporating the consent of the governed. We see this again as early as John Fortescue, very explicitly in I believe the 15th century. Writing in a time that's pre-modern, but still saying there's two kinds of polities. There's a royal polity and a royal and political polity, and the latter is the one that incorporates the consent of the governed. He says that's the one that's just. That's the one that Christians ought to support. That's the one that a just king should want, because then you know that you're not ruling by force of will or historical inertia, but by the consent of the governed. You have that legitimacy behind, your kingdom.
In fact, if you go as far forward as the Magna Carta, you see that to quite a large degree, even within Western civilization, that notion was honored, that even the king was held to a common law that made him common. It was common even to him. Yeah,
and we have the whole Magna Carta in this book as well. And one thing I thought was remarkable about it, at least the first time I read it, is how many of the signatories, usually it's it's framed as, oh, the barons, the aristocrats, they got together because they wanted to check the power of the king, which is true. But there are 30 ecclesiastical office holders who signed this before a single baron.
Priests, bishops.
The first article is that the English church remained free. It is an ecclesiastical document as much as a political document. The church was there fighting for liberty. So yes, there are of course historical sins of the church, but why do we only tell that story? Why do we let the enemies of the church dictate the narrative and then try to defend the straw man that they've constructed when we have this rich heritage, whatever our tradition, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, that we can build on and draw from?
Well, Dylan, tremendous joy to connect with you. Thank you so much for making the time. We've got about just under a minute left. Do you have a word of exhortation for the average Christian American listening to this right now in terms of living virtuously, but also sanctifying the republic that we do have?
Oh, well, I mean, the faith has to come first. I was talking with someone earlier about this, about how do we depolarize in such a polarized society. And I see in just this anecdotally, but in my own parish, I love that there was there's a former Republican state representative, there's, Democratic lawyer, and they'll be chatting, eating hummus and, carrots and whatever, and even talking politics in coffee hour. But they can do that because they know what's more important, because they have this common faith that unites them, and it puts those other things in their proper place. Those things are still important to them. They might not go away agreeing at the end of the day or voting the same way at the end of the day, but they're not at each other's throats. They're brothers and sisters in Christ. And if we put our faith first, everything else can fall in line.
Dylan, that was beautiful. My guest has been Dr. Dylan Pahman. He's a research fellow at the Acton Institute. We've been talking about this new volume that he and John Pinero edited. I interviewed John about this some time ago in the program, and so I was blessed to be able to connect with Dylan about this, The Christian Roots of American Liberty, published by Acton Institute. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peters.